Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about the French P38 pistol. We're going to go over some of the spooky history behind this gray ghost pistol and talk about kind of why the French have and were using German pistols. Now before we take a closer look at the French P38, we need to go back in history a little bit, and the history that I'm going to go over is pretty much the exact same history that I already went over in my French K98K video, so I'm just going to go ahead and put that here. So the Mauser-Oberndorf factory in Germany during World War II produced a lot more than just the K98K rifle. They produced pistols, they produced Lugers, P38s, they produced machine guns, they produced gun parts, they produced machine guns for planes. They really did a lot. It was kind of a pretty massive complex of factories and machine works. So now at the end of World War II, around April 17th, 1945, the Oberndorf factory just shut down. Allied troops were very, very close by. And just 3 days later, the French army came in and occupied the town of Oberndorf, Germany. And so the Mauser factory is now in French hands. The French knew what they captured. The French knew about the Mauser factory, of course. And pretty soon after taking over the town of Oberndorf, they set up a joint French-German management team to go in and figure out how they could ramp up production again at the Mauser factory. And by the end of May, production had already started. So here you're going from a time period of right at the end of World War II, you got the Battle of Berlin going on, the surrender, and then pretty soon after the surrender of Germany, the Mauser factory begins production again, of course this time under French occupation. Now for the French, the Mauser factory made K98Ks, they continued production of P38s, they made 22 trainers, they made some machine guns and some other things. So the Mauser factory was kind of up and running again right afterwards. Pretty much the same people doing the same jobs that they had been doing during the war. Pretty much guns of all phases were there, so you have just basically spare parts like barrels and receivers and bolts and stuff like that, all the way to rifles that were just completely assembled, that were just already been accepted and were just still sitting at the factory, and everything in between. So the French pretty much accepted guns through the whole plethora. Also, there were quite a bit of guns there that were there to be reworked or re-arsenaled. Maybe they're guns that taken damage and they're just there to get fixed. The French just took everything. They accepted all these guns once they went through the process. And the thing to take away from that is that it was June of 1945 when the French sort of restarted production at the Mauser-Oberndorf plant. They pretty much just hired all the workers that were already there. The workers just kind of kept doing what they were doing. They actually put in charge of the Mauser plant a German by the name of August Weiss. He was kind of, he was a higher up in like the DWM company, which was sort of over Mauser-Oberndorf. But they put August Weiss in charge of the Mauser-Oberndorf factory at the time. And the French, restarted production. But really the right term would probably be something like restarted assembly, because the French did not actually start like new production from scratch. They only started like assembling guns that were already made. Like they weren't getting batches of steel in and stuff like that. So they weren't like forging or whatever these gun parts anymore. At this point, there's huge stores of of parts and everything that were there. Of course, the Mauser factory was in the middle of production when it got taken over. So they just continued the assembling of guns that were in the plant. One of the things they did also was that guns that were there, maybe getting repaired, stuff like that, or maybe parts that were rejected from years past, they also assembled those into guns. So what you have is sort of like, you have a bit of a mismatch of guns. So kind of right before the war, Mauser's code switched to SVW. For the rifles, it was SVWMB, but for the pistols, it was just SVW45. They actually did sort of blocks of 10,000 of that, so like A, B, C, D, E, F. All the way to F is when the French took over. They took over about 3,000 into the F block. So the last 7,000 of the F serial numbers are the ones that the French took over. Now under French control, they started at the F block, and they went G, H, I, they skipped J for whatever reason, and then they did K. And in the K block is when they switched over to SVW46 in 1946. And then the very last block they did was the L block. They didn't get all the way through the L block. It's kind of estimated that maybe around 500 or so of the L suffix kind of exists out there. So L block is the very last one. So the great majority of these pistols are actually marked as SVW45 and then a few SVW46. Now there are some oddballs out there like this gun here. This example is a BYF44. So this obviously predates the occupation, so it's kind of interesting. This gun represents some of the ones that were, the guns that were either in for repair. There were some like Walther-made parts in the Mauser factory that the French assembled. And there was some earlier parts that maybe were rejected or never finished or something like that, that the French later on finished. And that's exactly what this is. We'll take a closer look at this gun in a bit, but there are some oddballs out there like that. So based on the estimated number of oddball pistols that there are out there, and with those serial number blocks, you know, if you kind of take for granted that there's, you know, exactly 10,000 guns in each block, just based off the serial numbers and the best guess, they think there's about 48,000 of these French P38s out there, which is kind of interesting because in looking for this number of total production, I actually checked out 3 different books, and each book gave a different number. So this book, The Military Handguns of France, they estimate 48,000 based on the serial numbers, which I do like that they were basing that on something kind of like a real-world example sort of thing. This book here, The Walther Handgun Story, they estimate, without giving like any reasons, like 50,000. In another part of the book it says 55,000 of the French P38s. It seems a little bit more like a guess in this book. Now the book that I would consider like the definitive work on post-war like Mauser pistols is this one here. It looks kind of shiny. It's The Parabellum is Back, 1945 to 2000 by Mauro Baudino, who's been on this channel before. He is the curator of the Paul Mauser archive. He actually co-authored this with Gerber von Vlemeren. Sorry about that. And this book actually gives documentation. There's pictures of the original documents, and there's transcripts of the interview of August Weiss, who was in charge of the Mauser factory. Now, August Weiss, he actually said that he thinks that there was 35,000 of these French P38s made from the factory, which is kind of interesting. It seems like a low number. I don't know if he had notes or where he got that number from, but he actually sort of estimated all the guns that were produced there. Also in this book, Parabellum is Back, there's a document where they kind of were putting the production of all the various guns in there. And as of May 2nd, 1946, this is an internal Mauser document from May 2nd, 1946 is when it was dated. But it kind of went over the previous month's sort of production, so like the end of month production. They put that for the month of April, there were 5,000 P38s that had the precision tests planned and 2,930 that were passed. So just for that month, that kind of gives you an idea of maybe how many they were doing per month. Now the total of the precision tests planned at the end of this production is 41,348. And under passed, it says that it was 36,720 that were actually passed. So, I mean, according to this official Mauser document, you know, it's at least 36,000 of these, you know, French P38s that were made. Maybe this 41,000 or whatever that they had tests planned, maybe they did those tests on the down low, maybe they didn't test, maybe they just assembled and put them out the door. So yeah, I don't know exactly what to do with this sort of contradictory information. I tend to believe Mauro's work in the official Mauser documents a little bit more, but I mean, just based off the serial number range, maybe there's like less oddballs than they think. Or maybe in each letter block they didn't do a full 10,000 pistols, something like that. But if there really is, you know, only between 36 and 41,000, you know, of these French P38s out there, probably the serial numbering didn't work like a perfect 10,000 each gun. I mean, it makes sense. It wouldn't be perfect after the war under French occupation. So I don't know exactly what to believe. I don't really know for sure. It's up to you guys what you want to believe, but there you go. It's somewhere between 55,000 on the high end, which I tend not to believe, and on the low end, based on this official document, 36,000. Let's take a closer look at the French P38 and compare it to a wartime example. Now this is a pretty typical example of a French P38 with the steel grips and the phosphate, coating on it. But not all of them are this way. Very early French P38s will look pretty much just identical to the German ones. It'll even have all the original German, Waffenamps and everything on it. This is not. This is a German, wartime production gun. This was made in '43. But the French ones would look pretty much just like this. They'd have the plastic Bakelite grips and they'd have the blue slide. For whatever reason, the French decided to stop bluing the P38s. They still blued the Lugers that the French produced Lugers at Mauser after the war. They still blued them, but they didn't blue the P38s. They switched to the phosphate. Probably had to do with cost or availability. They also used up the existing supply of these plastic grips. Most likely, whoever was making these for the Mauser factory wasn't making them anymore. But what they did have were these stamped steel grips. This is a late war sort of ersatz grip that the Germans came up with. So this was something that was available to the French to use. Supposedly these were used on actual German production very, very late in the war, but I'm not sure on that. I don't want to say that definitively, but this is sort of the staple grip that you'll see with these French P38s, these steel grips. There we go. So you just have one screw holding on the P38 grips, and so that's, obviously the internals and everything are phosphate coated, and that's just what the inside of these grips look like, because I haven't seen any examples of this online. On the regular Bakelite grips, the screw goes through the one side and it actually emerges on the other side, and it threads into a little steel insert into the grip that it screws into. But on these steel grips, it's a little bit different. The screw, of course, goes through on the one side. It comes through and there is this little protrusion sort of deal that's sort of stamped into this, and it screws into this here. So it gets screwed into this piece. The screw does not show on the other side of the steel grips. It just goes into there. So these are a good bit different than the plastic ones. They're also super thin. These grips are very thin. There's a little bit of flex to them when you bend them, but still pretty surprisingly strong for what they are and how thin they are. I'm sure all these ridges and everything kind of gives it a little bit extra strength. But just to show you the way these look like, so the French P38 is here, and this is a German wartime production gun. Obviously all the internals and everything on the French one is Parkerized. You can tell that at least one major component on the German one is not. So we take the barrel off of these to get a little bit of a closer look. The locking block on German-produced P38s is left in the white. Also, the firing pin inside of the gun is left in the white. Where on the French, they are both phosphate finished. So that's just another one of the differences. I guess if you saw like a firing pin or a locking block that was phosphated, most likely that's a French gun. The Germans did super late in the war start phosphate coating these instead of bluing them. But the great majority of them are going to be these French P38s. So this is an example of one of the Oddball guns. So this pistol right here was made in '44, so this is a BYF 44. A lot of these guns are going to have the same exact markings as the wartime guns, P38. You'll have an SVW 45 or SVW 46 most likely. Some of the oddballs include BYF 43s, 44s, 45s. There's even you'll find a couple Walthers in there, like a AC 44, AC 45 codes. And then you'll have the serial number here. This is, for these oddball pistols, the serial number is really kind of less important. But you can sort of tell a little bit what time your pistol was made if it is an SVW French gun. Now on this side is where you find really the main French marking. And there's really kind of the one definitive marking to show that it's French, and that is this star right here. Now the neat thing to point out about this is that this French star is put on at almost the exact spot that Waffenamps are added onto the gun. So right where the screwdriver tip is, that is the Waffenamp, the original acceptance Waffenamp of the gun, or at least the first of 3 Waffenamps that would have been put on. So the story of this gun is, typically as the pistols went through production process, they would be given 3 Waffenamps here, and I'll show you a wartime example pistol and the acceptance markings. So as they went through production, these are the Waffenamps that Mauser would put on them. So at each stage, they'd have an acceptance stamp. So you have the 3 here because this pistol went all the way through and it was actually ready for military use, and went out the door right to the military. Now the French guy here, this one, it only has 1. It only got 1 stamp in 1944, meaning that this gun most likely never went to the secondary process. So this one, this slide at least, probably had either some sort of defect or was never finished for some reason. I kind of sense that if that laid into the gun and that laid into the war, how desperate they were, if they weren't using all the slides they made, it was probably because something was wrong with it. They tended to make a lot more slides too, I think, than frames. So this could have been a leftover slide, something like that. But nevertheless, this gun never went through the full German sort of acceptance on it. It just has the 1 code or the 1 stamp on it before it got another one. So some previous oddballs like this, you will find all 3 stamps that it did go into German service, and then you'll also find a star. Some of the later ones you won't see any Waffenamps at all. You'll just see a star. So there is a little bit of variance with these guns just based on the markings. So here's a close-up of the German barrel. This shows some more definitive markings. Again, you have a German Waffenamp here. It's an Eagle 135. And then you have another French star right here. And then you have a star down on the locking block. So what you end up with on this gun is sort of these 3 main French acceptance markings. So you have the stamp on the slide, you have the stamp on the barrel, and the stamp on the locking block. So this is marking that these went through and the French approved of these parts, and that is what you should find on all these parts on your French gun. Pretty standard feature of these French P38s is the usage of a lot of late war and stamped parts. So you could tell this guy here, it's got this is sort of a rougher late war slide release. There's no serrations or anything on this. It's just like a stamped piece of metal. Whereas this earlier here, this is the 43 production gun. This has sort of the nicer slide release part, and it actually does have serrations on top to kind of help catch your finger as you release the slide. Now most of the differences between the French P38 and the wartime German ones is mostly cosmetic. These French P38s, they shoot, function, and everything just fine. I mean, you could kind of do a blind taste test really between like the French P38 and like a later war German P38, and they're going to feel very, very similar to each other. I think the trigger and everything and the safety, it works and everything just as fine on the German wartime pistol. So looks aside, shoots, functions, and everything just fine. So I wouldn't let the looks of these guns kind of deter you from shooting it or using it. So production of the P38 under the French, it ended in May of 1946 from Soviet pressure because there was an agreement signed between all the Allies that nobody was supposed to use any German factories to continue making guns. I mean, the German arms industry is just supposed to be completely just demolished, supposed to be gone, kaput. And so the Soviets pressured the French into stopping production of these military arms. But assembling of sporting arms continued, so like rimfire rifles continued until 1947. It was November 5th of 1947 when the French ordered the destruction of a bunch of the buildings and tools and everything that were left at the Mauser plant. They actually sent a whole bunch of the tools and parts and everything back to France. So I guess luckily a lot of those parts and stuff survived. A lot of the people that worked at the Mauser plant, when they knew that it was getting shut down, they took a lot of the documents and parts and odds and ends tools, stuff like that. They took them all home with them. So that's why the Paul Mauser archive exists today, is because a lot of those Mauser plant workers, they're really proud of their factory and their hometown pride sort of thing. and they kept a lot of those documents alive for us today. So thankfully, those still exist. But it was really Soviet pressure onto the French that made them, demolish, most of the plant. So that's why most of the original, Mauser-Oberndorf factory doesn't really exist today. What's left there is a nice museum. But the French used these P38s extensively after World War II. And it makes sense because I think the P38 is a perfectly adequate combat sidearm in the post-war period. I mean, single stack 9mm is, it took a long time for single stack 9mm to be completely replaced by in the 80s and 90s from the Wonder 9s. I wouldn't feel undergunned necessarily carrying a P38. I'd prefer a high power. But these served the French well. Now you might think that these served in peacetime after the war, but no, the French were heavily involved in a couple conflicts, one in French Indochina. So these pistols were put into action in Vietnam, and also in what was French Algeria. So in Vietnam and Algeria, these guns saw straight up frontline combat, lots of service. Probably not exactly this one because this one's pretty good shape. I kind of doubt it saw any sort of serious service. And these guns, even after the war, served in the French military up until the 1980s before these guns were really replaced. The P38 wasn't just used by the French after World War II. The Germans used the P38 after World War II. They officially, I think they replaced the P38s, the Germans did, in the 1990s. For a pre-World War II design, this had a really long lifespan, the P38s, and they saw good usage in the French army and multiple conflicts. So these guns still do have a neat history, even though they're not like a World War II pistol. So I think they're still pretty neat. They have a lot of cool history out there. French stuff is kind of popular right now. So the price that these French P38s bring is kind of surprising. These are comparable to German wartime pistols and price. This one I got for a pretty good deal because I think these metal grips and this Parkerization sort of look to it. I think it put off a lot of sellers, so it sat in a shop for a long time, and I ended up getting a pretty good deal on it. But it's a kind of, because it's not a nice beautiful blue finish of a wartime German one. This is a 1942 Walther produced P38. So because it's not this nice blue or whatever with these reddish Bakelite grips, people don't tend to really prefer these guns, but they're still neat. Still plenty of history behind them, and I do recommend checking these out, maybe picking one up if you run across it for a good deal. So this might be my last video here in this gun room. We have sold this house and we are moving to a new house. So I'm not quite exactly sure how I'm going to set up the new space to make videos in the new house. I don't know if I'm going to put up the same pegboard behind me in the same way or whatever, so it might look a lot different or mostly the same. I'm not sure, but there's probably going to be a lag between this one and the next video, just because I got to move everything over and build everything. I got to start kind of from scratch at the new place with this, but I'm pretty excited about setting up a new studio space and maybe fixing some of the mistakes that I made when I set up this gun wall. So if you guys want this wall behind me, or you want me to try a different sort of vertical rack, or if you like this but you just want different guns up there, let me know how you want to do this. I thought about all handguns here and then rifles here, or just the handguns going across to here and then all rifles down. I don't know. Let me know what you guys like, what you want to see behind, or if you want different guns or whatever. These have kind of been behind me for a while because they're kind of my favorites. So let me know what you guys want to see. Thanks for watching as always, and I'll see you next time.